Chapter 6 is entitled by the writers as creation, following the sea theme, but it's the word kingdom that resonates more in the overarching survey that we're making of the story in the Old Testament. So kingdom, it's the period of monarchy among the children of Israel, the political format that involves a king or kings, plural. And so it covers about a period of about 400 years approximately of the story of the descendants of Abraham, the Israelites. It is a period that begins with some good things, but tragically does not end well again. It's again the story of potential, but again disappointing choices that are made. Your textbook also chooses to cover by looking at some personalities, because there are lots of many individual stories within these 400 years, of course, and so they will highlight 5 in particular, and it is a story of nobodies and somebodies. Nobodies by the common standard, that is, people that are not in the news, in the big time news. And then, of course, there will be also stories of people that are, because of fame, power, politics, money, there are somebodies in the news. So again, see it both those terms being used in asterisks here. It's a story, first off, of what may seem to be a nobody, but it's important, very important, extremely important. A nobody story is very important in the overarching story of salvation and God and the Bible as a whole. And the story of important, powerful political figures, while may be obviously told because of their status among men, their status with God and in the plan of God is more important than maybe their human fame. So the story is going to continue, and this chapter covers 5 Old Testament books in a quick survey. The book of Ruth, the 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Let me go ahead and add that I'm going to go ahead and refer to in one slide to the 2nd book of Kings, and so not 4 but 5 basic Old Testament books are going to be covered in this chapter. And the major 5 characters that are going to be surveyed in a quick look at these 5 Old Testament books is a woman by the name of Ruth, and then a prophet by the name of Samuel, and then, of course, 3 kings, the first 3 kings of the united monarchy of Israel, and they are Saul, David, and Solomon. Let me go ahead and point out that it is rare in the Old Testament that an entire book would be take the name of a woman. There are 2 in the Old Testament, Ruth and Esther, and we'll focus a lot more on Esther, but it of course is not an anomaly, but it's unusual that there be a whole book dedicated to a feminine figure. There are many women in the Old Testament, many remarkable examples that we have already seen of womanhood, but one is here right after the book of Judges, or you could say coming out of the time of the Judges, is the story of Ruth. Ruth is a remarkable little booklet, 4 chapters long only. We're not sure exactly who wrote the narrative, but it belongs to the period of the Judges. So while the book of Judges concludes somewhere around the 11th century, you have to back up chronologically a bit to probably get the story of Ruth. We're not exactly sure of the century. You recall that the period of the Judges lasts from about the 1400s to the 11th century, so about 4 centuries. Somewhere probably in the early or middle period of that period of Judges comes the story of Ruth. And it may have been written, some scholars suggest Hezekiah, Ezra, some say Samuel, maybe Isaiah, but it is a story that belongs to the a period of the Judges. So if I had to pick one of those, I would possibly pick Samuel, but don't really know. It is a story of a foreign woman, a non-Hebrew, of a Moabite woman who marries into a family of Hebrews. And it's a story of a time of famine. Elimelech is a married man. He's married a woman by the name of Naomi. They have 2 sons. And in a time of famine, they abandon the promised land and go across the Jordan River and then to the south to live in a land that belongs to a pagan foreign culture. The Moabites, that had been enemies of the children of Israel, long-standing enemies, but that is where Elimelech settles his family to make a new living. The story quickly tells of tragedy. The men of the family, Elimelech first, and then the 2 sons as well, die. They're killed. And so story of tragedy. Tragedy as the widow, Naomi, is left without a husband. And then her 2 sons, who marry local women, pagan women, Orpah and Ruth, are the 2 Moabite women that her sons, that Naomi's sons, marry. They her sons are killed, and thus 3 women are left here in this landscape of a society whereby widows were kind of left out of no man's land economically and in other ways. Naomi is in a foreign land without her husband and sons, and so she decides to return home to Israel. And that is the plan. And thus she gives to her 2 daughters-in-law an option, actually a suggestion. Stay with your people. Stay back in the land of Moab, and I will return to my land. And while Orpah takes that offer and stays in her land, there is the amazing story of Ruth that, in love and dedication to her mother-in-law, follows her into the land of Israel. It is not only the love of Naomi that is strikingly a tender moment, but also, of course, it's not just the person of Naomi, but the faith of Naomi, or the religion, the worship of Naomi, of Yahweh, of Jehovah, that is also part of the landscape of Ruth. Ruth is not just by marriage part of the family and stays loyal. She's also loyal to the God of Naomi, and that is part of the narrative too. Ruth will come back, and they will both be destitute, and in an act of gleaning, of picking grain in a field of a landowner there in the promised land, the land of Israel, she encounters Boaz, a very important figure that and we have a romantic love story here embedded in one of the Old Testament narratives. And encouraged by Naomi, Ruth pursues and the advances of Boaz. Boaz follows some very important rules on how to approach a woman, a widow that belongs theoretically by Levirate law, by a Mosaic law, theoretically could be married by another tribesman. He follows the rules, and there is a romantic love story of Ruth and Boaz that ends up in a marriage and then in children being had, in particular the birth of Obed. And Obed is a very important figure in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, 1,000 years later. So a very important reason for which the story of a Moabite woman that is in the lineage of the Son of God is told, of the Messiah is told here in the Old Testament. Reading from Ruth chapter 1. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. She was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. As they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her sons, her 2 sons, and her husband. One of the most striking statements that resonates through time for the last 3,000 years of Ruth to Naomi, as Naomi offers her to stay with her people in the land of Moab, is this one. Ruth says to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. May the Lord do so to me, if anything but death parts me from you." It's not just a staggering sense of loyalty to her mother-in-law, but an adoption of her people. She says, I am joining your people because I am joining your God. I'm leaving the gods of the Moabites. I'm joining your God. A very staggering, again, reminder that the blessing that God gave to Abraham was meant for foreign people. And here is, like we saw in Jericho, another example of dedication to Jehovah, God of Israel, on the part of a foreign pagan woman. Here are some quick things about the book of Ruth. Unfortunately, in our quick survey, we must leave it to go on, leave her character, her story, and quickly move on to the story of others. But the book of Ruth is truly a masterpiece of narration, of narrative art. In 4 chapters, it is very densely packed, delightfully charming, and truly, in many senses, a classic love story, romantic love, while in many ancient cultures and in the Hebrew culture there are, of course, arranged marriages, such as we see in so many instances. There is also a room for, a place for, a presence of a romantic love, and this is truly what happens in a field while a woman is gleaning barley. You have the falling in love on the part of Boaz. Some scholars say too that it's delightful because it's kind of told. You're not in a battle scene like we've been before, about wars, and we're going to go back to those soon. But we're in a home environment. We're in a woman's environment. And the story seems somewhat, maybe the case or not, but be told somewhat from a woman's viewpoint. Definitely, a woman is a protagonist. It's a woman's world of Naomi and Ruth, and there is attention that is given to feminine values, feminine feelings, and without making too much of it, it is a delightful moment in the Old Testament, even though it's embedded in, of course, a time when both women become widows, and so the economic straits that puts them in, um, as they are, in a sense, viewed somewhat by culture as second-hand citizens in a man's world. The story of Ruth also brings to the forefront a couple of important legal institutions that were in practice by account of the Mosaic Law. One of them is property redemption, that is, the property associated with Elimelech. There are some laws and rights, hereditary rights, and Boaz is respectful of the Redeemer rules of property. But also there is embedded levirate marriage rules. Both of these are mentioned. You can read about that in Deuteronomy 25 if you'd like, the specifics of the law case, Mosaic law case of a levirate marriage, whereby if in a family a woman is widowed by her husband, then there's a next in line brother or relative that has first rights to marry or to take responsibility for that widow. Boaz respects that as well. Boaz will take on the role of a very kind, and stress a very delightful picture painted of this man, kinsman redeemer. The term is used in the Hebrew telling of the story 23 times. Kinsman redeemer. And here that concept of redeemer is even more to be stressed and viewed. Redeemer. He redeems Ruth from widowhood, from many things, but an important role as a foreshadowing of course, the larger role that Jesus Christ is going to take as Redeemer of all of mankind. Of course, Obed, the son that will come from the marriage of Boaz and Ruth, is very important because is in the lineage of David, King David, which we're going to see in these books as well. He's the grandfather of David, and thus not only he introduces us to King David, but also, of course, as Jesus of Nazareth will be a descendant of King David 1,000 years later, we are introduced to the lineage of Jesus of Nazareth. So, two major themes in the book of Ruth, as we have to quickly abandon this delightful book, is the kindness of Boaz in a very harsh world. Of the 12th, 13th, 14th century before Christ. And then the concept of redemption. And that overarching theme, of course, is the story of God wanting and setting in place a plan to redeem his people, all of creation, not just a woman or the Israelites, but all of mankind in the future. So here are one more thing that I might stress before we move on. When Elimelech leaves the promised land because of economic straits, he sets out to be in a foreign pagan no man's land. So he leaves God behind. And we're not going to say that it's a given that tragedy is going to happen, but once Naomi comes back as a widow to the promised land, then blessings replace the tragedy that hit her family when Elimelech chose to leave the promised land and go to a foreign land. Second of the major characters that is examined by chapter 6 in these 5 Old Testament books is a very important character, one that fulfills 3 different roles. He is not only the last judge of the judges that rule Israel and try to fix and bring people back to God and exercise the law and lead them into military battles. Remember, that function of a judge is not just, you could say, legislative, is also executive. But Samuel is not only a judge and the last of judges, and then the period of judges will be replaced with monarchy, but he's also a priest of God. Not all judges are priests, and definitely not all judges are prophets, but he fulfills three roles: judge, priest, and prophet. And he will be the last judge because he anoints the first two kings of Israel, not just the first, but also the second. And then his role will have been completely fulfilled. Now, Samuel is not a perfect human being. There will be some question about, well, why is he such a positive, great role, and then his sons are nothing like him? Why is there this character seemingly issue with his descendants, his next generation? We won't answer that in this particular lecture, but like we said, of all men and women, they're not perfect, but some fulfill importantly roles that God has in his larger plan, while others fail miserably. 1 Samuel 8, all the elders of Israel gathered together, came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "You are old, your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all other nations have." Samuel exercises his role as judge, priest, and prophet, speaks for God, and he also offers sacrifices to God. But then there comes a point, as he is in his latter days, that the elders of Israel come to him and say, "We want a king like the other people." And it's that last section that's the problem. The solution doesn't lie in a perfect form of politics here on earth. So whether it's monarchy or democracy or whatever it is, there may be some forms of politics that are better than others, but none are perfect. The problem that the Israelites have is not that they don't have a king like other people around them, but it's because of their disobedience to God. That's the problem. There are no perfect systems of human politics. And what that reveals, their statement of the elders to Samuel, is they think that being like the others, you could say peer pressure from the nations, pagan nations around them, that since he's about to die, that he needs to step them up to being like other people around them and appoint a king. God is going to give them a king and let Samuel anoint kings, but the solution is not going to lie in the form of politics called monarchy. That's not where the solution to their problem lies. So Samuel will anoint the first king of Israel. His name is Saul, and he will be an extraordinary physical specimen. He is tall and handsome and good looking and strong, and he kind of fulfills what from a human perspective might seem like a great choice for a king. The first king of Israel, Saul, will be from the tribe of Benjamin, and he will be anointed by Samuel as first king of Israel. And when he was chosen by God through Samuel, he will be the right man for the job. But again, the solution does not lie in monarchy or politics. It lies in the choices that not only Saul will make, but that the children of Israel will make as well. Here is a statement about the human perspective of Saul. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. So again, who's who's making this assessment? Is it God that is promoting physical handsomeness, or is it man's view of Saul? Is the answer um, for correct leadership? Now, there are obvious signs in the story of Saul as told in 1 Kings that he's the right stuff, so to speak, in certain aspects. He has signs that God is with him in his initial years as first king of Israel. God gives him an empowering spirit. God is with him. 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 10, when he and his servant arrived at Gibeah, a procession of prophets met him. The Spirit of God came powerfully upon him. He joined in their prophesying. So the king is given a spirit of prophecy by Jehovah God, and that is obviously a testament, a witness of the blessing of the presence of God with Saul in his beginning years. So an empowering spirit is given to him. But beyond that, King Saul is going to have to be a military leader, and he will have great initial military victories against pagan foreign people that are in parts of the promised land that need to be uh, uh, defeated and expelled from the promised land. And God will be here with him in military victories. Remember the story of Gideon, whereby God tried to say, look, I will give you victories with 300 men, a small army. You see, if I'm on your side, who can be against you? What does it matter how many there are on the other side of the battlefield? When God is with Saul, there is going to have great, and the emphasis here, initial military victories. The story of Saul, of one of the right men who turns tragically sour. This story, the end part of his life and his death, is definitely a tragedy because things go horrendously, terribly wrong in the latter years of his life. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. They told the messengers who had come, say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued. When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. They said to the Ammonites, tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever you like. The next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night they broke into the camp of the Ammonites, slaughtered them until the heat of day. Those who survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. This was just one moment in the book of 1 Samuel 11 where you see the great military victories with the help of God that are brought on as one of the foreign enemies, the Ammonites, is defeated. Saul is seen as a great blessing to Israel as he leads them into military victories. A third evidence of the fact that Saul was the right man for the job initially is that he also was given the wisdom. When he called up God, God answered. He was given advice. And he was given the support of God's prophet, Samuel. He was the greatest of advisors, Samuel was. He spoke for God. He gave advice for God. He was wise in his days as judge, prophet, and priest. And so, with a right-hand man like Samuel, how could Saul go wrong? But of course, the whole secret for success lies in listening to Samuel, to his advice, to his wisdom, and seeking his support. It's when Saul starts doing things of his own free will, starts thinking himself to be sufficient without the advice of Samuel, and definitely not desiring the criticism of Samuel, that things turn horribly wrong. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord. Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. There are great moments in the story of Saul and his relationship with Samuel. And Samuel it leads him to great heights. But there are then mistakes. The story of Saul, first king of Israel, is one of great expectations and dashed hopes. Mistake number one. Like we had seen with Moses, in a sense, a similar mistake to Moses, who has a temper. Saul is impatient. He wants things now. He expects things now. Saul grows impatient in one particular moment, waiting for Samuel to arrive so that he can offer sacrifice prior to a battle. That is the realm of priests. Saul is not a priest, he's a king. And when Saul gets impatient, he forgets his self and his role and his limits, and he disobediently chooses to offer the sacrifice himself. He steps over a line, and that is a sign of one of the weaknesses of Saul's personality. Too much power has him forget his place, in humility, and his role, and thus he oversteps an important line. His mistake number two is narrated in 1 Samuel chapter 14. This is kind of a progressive tragedy in the happening, so to speak. So great things, and you see him make mistakes. Mistakes have consequences, especially if you don't learn from them. In 1 Samuel 14, in the middle of battle, Saul makes a foolish vow. We have seen vows that are uncalled for, unseemly, untimely before, and Saul makes a vow. When he fulfills the vow that he shouldn't have made, when he doesn't fulfill the vow that he should have made, because it would have led to the death of his son Jonathan, then there are issues to be made. You don't just talk out of turn. You don't promise things that you shouldn't deliver. What you say matters, especially a king, but that's true of all people. He makes a foolish vow. And when fulfilling that vow leads him, by the way, a very small matter led up to this, leads him to have to kill his son, well then we have a problem. Mistake number three is one of the most dramatic moments and the obvious turning. He doesn't learn. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul leads into battle forces of the Israelites, and he has very clear instructions from God to absolutely not spare any of the Amalekites. Again, we could second guess God if we like here, but that's not the point. The point is, God said, destroy them all. The reason for which Saul does not destroy all the Amalekites is not because he feels like God is being cruel. It's because he is influenced by the peer pressure of his own army, who wants to keep some stuff and keep some people. And when he chooses to listen to his own men and succumb to peer pressure rather than the very specific instructions of God, well, that is the last straw. He has crossed a line from which he's not going to come back, and he should know that. He's second-guessing God clearly here, and that's his mistake. So Samuel has to come to him as a spokesman for God and said, well, you did it. You've crossed the line. You have rejected the word of the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. You know, you've been blessed because anytime you dialed up God, God answered. Or when God spoke to you, you listened. You have stopped dialing God. You have stopped listening to God. You have, in your pride, uh, decided that you'll take or leave God. Well, then now God's not going to answer your phone calls anymore. And let's see how you do now. That is what is the sad, tragic message of Samuel to King Saul. And King Saul will die of a tragic mortal wound in battle. And the most awful part of that end of Saul is that he begs his attendant, his servant, to finish him off so he wounded as he is, he won't fall into the hands of the enemy and be tortured and his death be prolonged. The attendant of Saul refuses to kill the king of Israel, and therefore Saul commits suicide, which in Hebrew society, Hebrew culture, is an absolute no-no. We will see in other societies, pagan cultures, including the Romans, that suicide will be seen as a noble way out if you know you're going to be put in front of a firing squad or be tortured. But in Jewish society, it is not. Remember that suicide is not okay with the God of Israel. And remember that narrative as you go into the New Testament and look at the story of the betrayer of Jesus, Judas. That is another suicide that is, of course, viewed very differently within Hebrew culture. But let me move to where this slide now has us, which is the second king of Israel. There are three kings of Israel of the united monarchy, Saul being the first, David being the second. The second king of Israel, his story intersects the life of Saul. David, of course, is a young man when Saul is king, but David will be the second king of Israel, and his story will stand out as a stark contrast to that of Saul in his latter years. Saul was the right stuff in his beginning years, but he will become the wrong stuff by his own choices. David, the young man David, comes from a very different background, physically very different. He's just a shepherd boy. He is not, you could say, seen to be royal stuff. And instead, he's going to be the most celebrated king of Israel in all of time. It's the Star of David. It's the city of David, Jerusalem. David will be viewed even to this day, 3,000 years later from when he lived and died, as the apex of the free nation of Israel, united nation of Israel. Saul's the first king, but David is the king that's going to carry the symbol of the greatest moment in time in the story of the Hebrew people. So from the very beginning, David is in very stark contrast to Saul. And I guess one of the things in the Old Testament narratives, 1st and 2nd Kings, about King David is going to be the appellative, the statement about him that he's a man after God's own heart. Now that is going to be evident as to why it is so in so many details of the story of the life of David. It is going to be a bit puzzling at times when you are made aware of some big mistakes that David made as well. But there is a difference between David and Saul. Just to put it out there from the very beginning, repentance is the issue. If you learn from your mistakes, it's one thing. If you don't, it's another. The difference between Saul and David is the difference between repentance and lack thereof. Do not consider his appearance of his height. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. uh, from the very beginning of our introduction to David, it is said, look, um, you were impressed by the height and the handsomeness of King Saul. You said, of course, he's made king. Well, maybe we should try looking at it from God's perspective. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. From God's perspective, it's not handsomeness and height. It is something different. It's the heart, the character, the courage, the personality. People look at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. And of course, it's not speaking of the muscle. The heart is kind of the repository of the essence of a human being. So Saul, the contrast of how Saul acts in his latter years underscores how smart, brave, and dedicated David is. Some of the stories of young David as a shepherd boy, and then as even an assistant of Saul, an attendant of Saul, a musician of Saul. That is the characters, the virtues of David are going to be spotlighted, and they're going to stand out as we see the demise of Saul over the last few years and months of his life. This is one of the many paintings of the famous Italian painter of the late 16th century, Caravaggio. It has a young boy standing over the lifeless body of a beheaded giant. Of course, David and Goliath. While your textbook doesn't spend a lot of time on that, that's probably the most famous of all the narratives. The story of a young boy that comes, a shepherd boy, who comes to give sandwiches to his three brothers, older brothers that are fighters in the army led by King Saul against the Philistines. And it is an embarrassing moment in the story of King Saul, because there is a 9-foot-high giant that every morning and every night taunts from across the battlefield. That nobody else has to die, nobody else has to fight. If the Israelites will just send one person to fight him, and then whoever wins, that will call the day and call the victory or the defeat of one side or the other. And the embarrassment that a young teenage boy, David, feels when nobody answers the call, and so he volunteers to go himself. King Saul is impressed by his faith and dedication and courage and gives him his armor, but the armor of King Saul is way too big for the shepherd boy, and besides, he's not a trained warrior, and so he simply faces the giant with just the weapons of a shepherd, a slingshot and 5 stones. A quick note, you're going to need God's help in facing a giant that's 9 foot tall, a warrior with weapons, and that has a spear that he can very easily thrust at you with a tip end that weighs 17 pounds. What are the odds in this battle? Whether God is with you, well, then it doesn't matter how big and how strong and how mighty the giant is. And by the way, you don't need 5 stones if God is with you. All you need is 1. And that's all it will take to hit the giant in the forehead, to where stunned he is brought down, and then David uses the giant's own sword to simply cut his head off. This is an astonishing act of courage and victory and faith in God that is seen in this particular narrative, and which will impress King Saul very much and be a defining moment in the life of this young shepherd boy. There is going to be, in the final years of Saul, as he becomes after he's impressed by this young man and brings him to his court and uses him, he's going to become extremely jealous. You see, things go, if you stop calling up God and trusting in God and listening to God, then the worst part of your human condition comes out, and jealousy moves Saul to try to kill David, and David would be protected from this attempted assassination of his own king. And there will be those that side with the house of David, those that will be, of course, with the house of Saul, the king, and civil war will break out between the two houses, especially after King Saul's death by suicide on that battlefield, because God is not with him anymore. Civil war will break out. This is not a good moment in the story of the children of Israel, but it is a necessary moment, you could say, that will come to be. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns, and the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king of Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. So, King Saul dead, there is a civil war, and then finally there's a unification. Those that had been loyal to King Saul are brought under him, and Samuel has anointed David as king. He is chosen by God, but then acknowledged by the rest of Israel. And at the age of 30, he becomes the second king of Israel, and he will reign for 40 years. Now, David will be a king that will be a warrior king. He doesn't just kill, as a shepherd boy, exotic wild animals that are trying to kill his sheep. And he doesn't just kill Goliath. He will need to reconquer or conquer for the first time parts of the promised land that have not been taken from foreign enemies, and defend Israel from foreign invaders. And so he's going to conquer Jerusalem, and that's an important moment. The Jerusalem under King David becomes the capital of Israel. There's not been a real city on that Mount Moriah. We first encountered it with Abraham 1,000 years before, when we suggested strongly that he went up that mountain to sacrifice his son Isaac. 1,000 years later, the citadel that's on Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, will be conquered by David. He will then proceed to defeat the Philistines in his campaigns. He will bring the Ark of the Covenant to the city of Jerusalem in a very important gesture. That's where so many of the tablets of God that were given by Moses, by God to Moses 500 years before, and many other things that are contained, and it's kind of a symbol of the presence of God among the children of Israel. And God will make a covenant like he made with Abraham. He will make it with David. God will promise that it will be a descendant of his that will establish a kingdom that is going to last forever. Now, the kingdom of David is going to break up in just a few decades, and it's going to be completely destroyed and absorbed by foreign pagan kings 4 centuries later. So the promise that God makes to David is about a kingdom that will last forever, and it will be one of his descendants. And of course, this is one of the many prophecies messianic prophecies that are given in the Old Testament. And this one, of course, relates directly to the lineage of David, to the physical lineage of David. Jesus is the fulfillment of that promise 1,000 years later. Jesus will be born of a descendant of David. Of course, that's Joseph. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, David is a remarkable figure, man after God's own heart, and will be the one through whom the Messiah will descend 1,000 years later. But David also is has faults, and they seem staggeringly big sometimes, like, for example, in the well-known story of David and Bathsheba. That is well known. How could a man like that, making that kind of mistake, compounded mistake, how could he be a man after God's own heart? And again, the answer to that logical question lies in repentance. David is king, and he gets the attention of many, and he has power. And when he sees the wife of one of his military commanders bathing on top of a rooftop, he becomes lustful of her and finds a way through his kingly ways to sleep with her. She gets pregnant, and then there is the issue of now what? It's going to be known, since the husband was away at war, that it's not his child, and so he arranges for the husband to be put on the front lines by his orders, and thus the likelihood of his being killed is extraordinarily true. And thus the husband of Bathsheba, a loyal, dedicated military commander of David, that's one of the ironies here, is killed in his dedication to his own king. Uriah is his name. Uriah is killed, and then David thinks he has covered up, of course, this sin of his among men. But of course, there's always, in every action and thought of man, the third eye, you could see. God is present in all of our actions and our thoughts. And what was David thinking? Samuel comes to David as he had gone to King Saul, and he says, what you have done has displeased the Lord. God sees, knows the actions, and he reveals them to Samuel, and David is exposed. And there is always a consequence to sin. The sadness of 2 Samuel chapter 12 is that the consequence ordained by God for the great sin of David and Bathsheba is that the child which is born out of their sin is not going to live. Now remember that the eternal destiny of this child is not up for discussion here. God gives life and God takes life. But the consequence of the sin here is given in the death of the child announced to David. And then David, the realization of the consequence of his sin comes crashing in on him. And one of the saddest moments in all the Old Testament is when David lies prostrate on the ground for 7 days while his child lay sick, praying to God to please take his own life, spare the child, take his own life. He would like to trade his life in. Now that's a remarkable moment, and is different than Saul. Now God's not going to answer the request of David in that fashion. The child is going to die. And it is true that also that as soon as the child dies and King David is informed, he gets up, he washes himself, he eats. He hasn't eaten for 7 days while he's been prostrate on the ground begging God to spare the child. When the child is taken, he gets up and he proceeds with the rest of his life to serve God. There is repentance on the part, a realization of his sin, and that marks the difference between David and Saul. He repents of his sin, but there are going to be other consequences as well for David. David is the right man, but our wrong choices do have consequences. Not only does his child die, but also his kingdom is going to unravel. One of the consequences of the imperfections of King David. One of the moments that you also need to remember of King David, beyond this, of course, sad moment of the loss of his child, is one connected with a disease, a plague that hits the children of Israel, and the correct choice that David makes, the correct example of leadership that he gives. We are on Mount Moriah because God said he wanted David to establish a place for him up there on that mountain. Reading from the Old Testament, on that day Gad went to David and said to him, "Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." So David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad, and when Araunah looked and saw the king and his officials coming towards him, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant to buy your threshing floor?" David answered, "So I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague of the people may be stopped." Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king make whatever he wishes and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and here are threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood. Your Majesty, Araunah gives all this to the king." Araunah also said to him, "May the Lord your God accept you." But the king replied to Araunah, and here's the important thing. David says to this man who's offering him for free the place where he's supposed to build an altar to Lord Jehovah, he said, "No, I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." David has learned some things in his life. One of them is personal sacrifice and dedication to God involves sacrifice. So this is a good, positive moment where you see the reasons for which David is a man after God's own heart in spite of great faults. David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord there, sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered his prayer on behalf of the land. The plague on Israel was stopped. The geographical place where this important moment in the life of David happens is one of the major points. It happens on Mount Moriah. It happens where 1,000 years before, Abraham sacrificed his son, or was called to, but then sacrificed a ram. So 1,000 years later, David builds an altar like Abraham had, and that is an important moment. And of course, this geographical location will be where his son, Solomon, will build the permanent house of God, the temple of God of the Hebrew people. The third king of Israel, of the United Kingdom, is Solomon, the third king of Israel. He's going to be blessed by God with wisdom while King Saul had Samuel, Samuel now is dead. King Solomon, son of David, is going to be blessed by God with wisdom and great wealth. He's going to be rich and wise. Now watch out. Just because God gives you wisdom doesn't mean because you know the right thing to do that you're going to do it. This is not he's an automaton. He's simply a robot programmed by God to always do the right thing. Solomon is still retains free will, even though he knows what to do is right. That does not always preclude choosing to do the wrong thing. And by the way, having all the money in the world, power, wealth, fame, which Solomon's going to have, is not the answer to not only happiness, but a good life as well. Solomon is going to be the one that is going to build the permanent house of God, the temple. Remember, God had been living more or less, so to speak, in a tabernacle, a tent, ever since Mosaic times, 5 centuries before. We are now after the year 1000, and it is Solomon who is the third king of Israel, and he's going to get permission from God, be authorized by God, to build a house for him on Mount Moriah, on that mountain, on Mount Zion, also another term that's going to be used. And that is because David had blood on his hands. He was a warrior king, and God wanted a king that did not have blood on his hands, and Solomon is going to inherit from his father, you could say, a more stable kingdom. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to be able to retain it, because things can always change, and they will within one generation. There's a sense in which we're always one generation away from either disaster or blessings. All it takes is one generation to not do the right thing or to do the right thing. Here is a model that's been replicated of the temple on Mount Moriah. Solomon will have not only the money, but also the contacts throughout the Middle Eastern world of that time, of the 10th century before Christ, to bring all kinds of precious material from all over the known world and truly build a most extravagant house of God on earth, some say. In ancient times, among pagan cultures, there were many wonders. In fact, there are several lists of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, from the pyramids of Egypt to the Colossus of Rhodes to many others. One of the great architectural marvels of the ancient world of the 10th century before Christ is clearly the temple that Solomon built for God, Jehovah, on Mount Moriah or Mount Zion in Jerusalem. This one will only last 4 centuries before it's destroyed. And so we only have attempted reconstructions of that 9-story high Holy of Holies and holy and courtyards and all of that. And you're looking at a reproduction of what that temple may look like with its precious metals and ivory and wood from Lebanon and many other artifacts used by Solomon to build the temple of God. Some of the other important narratives associated with this king is the visit by monarchs like the Queen of Sheba from areas of Arabia that are narrated in 1 Kings chapter 10. This is a painting by Piero della Francesca, an Italian painter, of the great aristocrats and kings and of that time that came to visit Solomon, not only because of the extravagant palace and temple, but also because of the wisdom. The wisdom of the King Solomon became known in all the ancient world of that time, and even the Queen of Sheba, pagan queen, came to visit him. Here's the instructions for any man, and definitely for King Solomon. Observe what the Lord your God commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do wherever you go. The instructions are the same. If you stay with God, God stays with you. And while Solomon seems to be greatly blessed with wisdom and power by God, the surface, of course, looks good, but there's always that hint that you may be blessed with wisdom, but unless you do what you know to be right, well, things will turn horribly wrong. And that is the story of King Solomon. There were some clear specifics, not just follow God's commandment. Before law, the law said that leaders, kings, were not supposed to accumulate large number of horses. Our version of cars, means of transportation, fancy vehicles, etc. That was kind of a written rule. Another one, don't accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Your power does not lie in your bank account or in your fancy cars, so to speak. And one more thing, do not take, like foreign kings who had harems and many queens and many, do not take many wives for yourselves. Solomon knew this. This was not unclear. He did not lack understanding of these specific boundaries, guidelines for his personal choices. And however, knowing these things does not make it so that Solomon has to follow them. So here is where Solomon goes horribly wrong. He is listed as accumulating over 12,000 chariot horses. So you start thinking that your power lies in the number of your stables. Solomon's stables become famous in his day and his time. He accumulates a massive amount of gold and silver because of the prosperity that God affords him. However, he thinks that the accumulation of these are the reason for his wealth and power and a solution to happiness in life. He will also, incredibly enough, take 700 wives and 300 concubines. We could get into what's the difference, and we might be hard-pressed to say so. So we'll just say 1,000 is the number combined, and that is staggeringly over the line given by God. Not just 2, 3, 4, 5, but far more than that. So, one of the wives that he will marry will be even one of the daughters of Pharaoh. You see, diplomacy and contacts with foreign leaders leads him to do what foreign leaders do, these marriages, political marriages of convenience. And in it, Solomon shows his lack of choosing to do the wise thing, lack of doing what God prescribes. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifice to their gods. This passage reveals to you that it's not just a matter of taking foreign wives. The reason for which God had said don't take foreign wives was because they influence him rather than him influence them. And so they bring in the gods of the Ammonites and horrendous man-made gods like Molech, that is for which the practice of human sacrifice was well known as well. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's commands, and we know how this story is going to end. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my commandment and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to the one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hands of your son." So we already know how this united kingdom is going to go. It's destined by God to have a terrible wreck, to be a wreck, because of the choices that are made by Solomon. So a quick review. David is kind of like a Messiah-like king who delivers Israel from the disasters of Judges. And that's the reason for which, in the history of the Hebrew people to this day, it is King David. It is the Star of David. It is the city of David, Jerusalem. He becomes kind of a moment in time that they look back to as the peak, the best of times. Not perfect, because David wasn't, but the best of times when Israel was unified and under a great leader. But as we said, David is just a human being. As a mere man, he stumbled, leaving us looking forward to his descendant 1,000 years later, the real Messiah, who will be without sin, the only human to be without sin, because he's also God. As Israel, God often works quietly in our lives without us realizing it. We don't always see the hand of God in our everyday moments and decisions and difficult moments, but He is aware. He knows not only every hair on our head, but He knows our needs and disasters and prayers before we even utter them. He knows our needs before we know them ourselves. And so God is quietly at work in our lives without us realizing. What to apply from the story of King David? Seek to have the heart of God. Even when you make big mistakes, come back to Him. Repent, prayer. That is an important moment. That's what David teaches, and God will somehow use your talents and abilities in spite of your mistakes. So be brave, be courageous. Face the Goliaths of your life. Do so with humility, remembering that you're not the one that achieves things, but you do so with the gifts and the blessings of God. So no matter how high up, mature, how talented we may think we are, or people say we are, we can fall into temptation. So temptation is always around the corner. One of the other lessons that comes out of the story of King David. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. Here's another one. So do not follow standards of feminine beauty or male handsomeness, physical attributes being the top standards of our time, indeed of most of human culture. People look at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. The heart of human beings is where you are encouraged to look to find the real person. So we conclude this chapter 6.